Hello and welcome to my channel. Rhino here. It's that time of year again. The time when kids come home from school and cough directly in your face with all the germs they collected so that now I can be here, sounding funny, nursing a hot cup of tea to ease my sore throat, all while recording. It's just simply magical. Anyway, today I've got two words for you. Genesis Apologetics.
Now that's a name I've not heard in a long time. Long time.
It's been almost a year since the last time I covered anything of theirs, so let's see what they've been up to.
Take a look at our North American continent.
Ooh, you got a new narrator. Cool. I'll miss the nasally guy, though. Okay, we'll look at North America.
Do you see anything that might indicate a catastrophic past?
Well, that depends on how closely we're looking and how far back in time we're looking and how big something has to be before you'll consider it catastrophic. I mean, I'd say the hurricanes that are getting worse over the past decade are pretty catastrophic, but North America also had a huge chunk of rock crash into it about 65 million years ago. That's a major globally scaled catastrophe, so what it really comes down to is how big something has to be before you'll consider it catastrophic, and really, no matter what the answer is, yes, there is evidence of catastrophe in North America.
One of biblical proportions?
Yes, a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Something so horrible that it brings to mind the terrible story of a merciless God drowning everybody and everything indiscriminately except for a handful of people. I know what you're going for there, but you really should avoid using phrases that point out that the action of flooding the entire world was so heinous and cruel that we use it to over-exaggerate bad things that happen today to emphasize how horrible they are.
A catastrophe so massive that it pushed up mountain ranges that cover many states today?
I mean, the mountain ranges were mostly caused by tectonic activity. That's kind of a slow process. Does this mean that you guys are of the creationist camp that thinks pretty much all of the features of the Earth were caused during the flood? Because let's just face it, that's completely nuts. The amount of geologic activity that would have had to happen over the span of a single year in order to separate the continents and raise the mountains, all while enough water is falling to cover the entire surface of the Earth completely, would not just be catastrophic. It most definitely would have caused the extinction of all but the most hardy extremophiles on Earth, and even maybe them. Just look at what happens with earthquakes now. The 2017 8.1 magnitude earthquake in Mexico saw the fault move by about 10 meters. A magnitude 8.1 releases an amount of energy equivalent to about 6.25 million tons of TNT. And since everyone seems to like to compare stuff like this to the Hiroshima bomb, that's 313 Hiroshimas. And it moved by about 10 meters. Now, there's a lot more to the relationship between the movement of the plates and how much energy is released in earthquakes, but if we look at this as a kind of standard and extrapolate it out, Brazil is 2,848 kilometers away from Liberia, making the narrowest portion of the Atlantic Ocean 2.848 million meters. This means that in order for the majority of the continental drift to have happened during the flood, as seems to be proposed here, the Americas would have had to drift away from Africa at a rate of 7,800 meters per day during the flood. That's 780 of these 2017 earthquakes per day, releasing the equivalent of 244,000 Hiroshima bombs every day for an entire year. And that's just looking at an area that's about 150 kilometers long. Using some really quick and dirty measurements of a map in Photoshop, it seems that the coastline of the Americas adds up to roughly 13,500 kilometers. So that's 244,000 Hiroshima bombs for every 150 kilometers, for a total of 3.3 billion Hiroshima bombs every day just for the coast of the Americas. Now remember that the entire surface of the Earth is supposed to be covered with a ridiculous amount of water. That has its own problems. And imagine the tsunamis that would be happening here. Now keep in mind, for this whole thing, I've been working off numbers from an 8.1 magnitude earthquake, because that's the one where I actually found how far the fault actually moved. The 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake, which caused the subsequent tsunami, was a magnitude 9, which still would have been tiny compared to what would need to happen for the amount of tectonic movement you're proposing during the flood, and it released an amount of energy equivalent to 1,500 Hiroshima bombs. So I've been working with ridiculously small numbers so far. The 2004 tsunami reached heights of 24 to 30 meters, and the total energy of just this one tsunami was estimated to have been equivalent to more than twice the explosive energy used during all of World War II, including the 2 atomic bombs. Since the whole world is covered in water during the flood, all of this geologic activity would be causing massive tsunamis and releasing ridiculous amounts of energy in a very short period of time. Are you seriously telling me that a relatively small wooden boat was able to survive this?
One that was so intense that it resulted in 13 states being filled with billions of fossils, including hundreds of thousands of dinosaurs, mixed with marine creatures?
There are lots of fossils there, sure, but that doesn't mean they all died at the exact same time. And yes, there was a marine environment over a good chunk of North America in the late Cretaceous called the Western Interior Seaway. So we find marine fossils and land animal fossils all across what is now land in North America.
The markers of a worldwide flood that covered North America are obvious and are clearly still seen today.
Not really. If you look at the stories that the fossils tell as a whole, you see entire fully developed ecosystems with their own fauna and flora being replaced by entire different ecosystems with their own fauna and flora. It is not a jumble of everything that lived together being buried in different layers. It is specific creatures existing in specific layers with zero crossover. There are thousands of layers, each of which tells a story of the organisms that live there, and each story is different. If all the fossils, or at least the vast majority of them, were laid down in one event, you wouldn't be able to get these cohesive stories of what different ecosystems looked like with these layers. It would have all been mixed together.
Let's go back in time to see if we can reconstruct just what happened during the biblical flood of Noah's time.
Well, I've already done a bit of the reconstruction for you, and it doesn't look good for Noah. I didn't even get into the calculation of how much water would have had to fall during the 40-day period in order to actually flood the entire world. I did that one in a different video. Spoiler, it's a lot. Like, a completely impossible amount of water.
Before the flood began, North America was different, much different. You couldn't even put boundary markers around what we now call California and much of the West Coast.
So, just confirming, it is looking here like you do think that the continents were together in one supercontinent before the flood. So the flood had a year of ridiculous geologic activity whose repercussions would have wiped out all life, including Noah. And my calculations didn't even touch Asia or Australia.
South America was pressed up against North America. Most of the high hills did not even exist, at least not yet.
Yeah, so the Earth was relatively flat in your viewpoint. That decreases the amount of water needed for the flood, but it doesn't really sit well with the whole 15 cubits above the highest mountain line. Sure, it doesn't say how high the mountain is, and the Hebrew word there can sometimes be translated as hill, but it is referencing high places. The Earth wasn't one gigantic plain, it had topography, so it needed more water than currently exists on the Earth. I'm not running the numbers on that one, it's been done before, but suffice it to say that the sudden appearance and subsequent disappearance of so much water just isn't plausible.
The environment was much different, and large creatures roamed the lush green landscape, thriving in what was intended to be paradise.
And if the intent was to make it paradise and make it perfect, then a perfect God would have made it a perfect paradise. The fact that we ended up with a so-called fallen world is because God wanted it to end up that way. What other explanation is there? I don't think the whole free will thing is really satisfactory for this. If God is all-knowing and all-powerful, then he knows how to make people that have free will and freely choose to do the right thing, and he has the ability to make them that way. He also has the knowledge and power necessary to prevent the serpent from mucking it all up. If you are willing to concede that God does not have omnipotence or omniscience, then this story makes a bit more sense. But as long as you insist that God does have these qualities, it is logically impossible that any outcome happened that ran contrary to God's intentions.
But when human wickedness became unrestrained and every thought of the human heart was only evil continually, God decided to wipe this rampant wickedness from the face of the earth.
So every single thought was wicked all the time? Do you know how exhausting that would be? There are so many small minutiae of everyday life that are neither good nor evil that we have to think about, like, what do I wear today? What am I going to have for breakfast? Would going left or right be a faster way to get where I'm going? Stuff like that. How do you decide which direction to go in a more wicked way? I could get there by turning left or right, but I think I'll go left. It is not possible for every single thought to have been wicked. And what about the children? Every single one of their thoughts were wicked too? And God, the all-powerful, all-knowing God, decides that the punishment for these wicked kids is execution rather than rehabilitation? And not just execution for the people. Oh no, that's not good enough. These human beings are so evil that they've tainted all the plants and animals too, so they all need to die as well. No possible way for an all-powerful being to have gotten rid of the humans without destroying everything else on the planet as well.
Genesis 6 records that God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth."
His problem with humanity is their proclivity for violence, so he decides to destroy them violently? Sure, that sounds reasonable.
The process you're about to see unfold will show you just how life on Earth was extinguished with the earth, save those on the ark.
How can you say that exact sentence and still come out of this thinking that God is the good guy? When is the person who extinguishes all life on Earth ever the good guy?
The Bible records that this fearsome display of God's wrath began when all the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were open. When this happened, the North American continent began a major transformation. Animals living in rich pre-flood habitats were about to be rapidly buried and entombed by tsunamis, mud flows, and volcanic ash.
Yeah, I'm sure enough rain falling on the planet to raise the water levels to impossible heights would indeed induce some mud flows. But volcanic ash? With the amount of rainfall that would be needed to flood the entire planet, wouldn't the volcanic ash turn into a mud flow? I mean, I might be wrong there. I'm not a geologist, but I see what you're trying to do here. You're trying to make sense of all the different types of depositional events, but there are too many that don't make sense in a flood. Now, again, I'm not great at geology, so I'll grant you the mud flows, but aeolian deposits? That's wind and dry sand. I wouldn't think you'd find much dry sand in a worldwide flood. What about coastal deposits? There are layers that can be traced laterally across several different environments for the same time period. So in one layer, we can see it go from marine to beach to terrestrial plain, all with evidence of organisms going about their life normally with no flood. That's a neat trick if it happened during a worldwide flood. And what about evaporative deposits, where the water needs to be stagnant long enough for the evaporation to occur? Or deltaic deposits from a river delta? If the whole Earth is underwater, there's no rivers to have deltas.
As the fountains of the great deep split apart, catastrophic oceanic rifting quickly spread around the globe. The scars of this rifting remain today, with some 40,000 miles of mid-ocean ridges visible on the ocean bottom.
So if I understood that properly, your explanation for the tectonic plates that we see today is that they are a leftover from the rapid movement of the surface of the Earth during the flood? Let me just ask, what part of a flood would actually push land masses apart, and at rates that are hundreds of thousands of times the rates we see today? What caused that, and how did a small wooden boat survive?
This rapid rifting caused oceanic plate to plunge or subduct beneath the North American continent.
Which creates a whole new set of problems for this model. My calculations on how much energy would have been released in order to separate North America from Europe and Africa by the distance that we see today were based entirely on the East Coast. I completely ignored the ridiculously fast subduction that would have had to happen on the West Coast. And that's just taking North America into consideration. There would have been similar things going on all the tectonic plate boundaries. Now, there are 7 major tectonic plates, but some are quite a bit smaller than the ones I've been running the numbers for. And North America and South America are on separate plates, so to be generous, I'll just multiply the total energy output by 7 instead of 14, leaving us with a total energy output from just the tectonic activity of 23.1 billion Hiroshima bombs every day for the duration of the flood. Distributed evenly across the 510 million square kilometers of the Earth, that would be the equivalent of 4.5 Hiroshima bombs per day on every single square kilometer of the surface of the Earth. I'm sorry, but I just do not buy that a wooden boat, no matter how well built or what the dimensions were or what the shape was, could possibly survive that.
Just as today, ocean plates plunging into the Earth generated earthquakes and tsunamis.
Yeah, just like today, when they're moving 7 orders of magnitude slower than you are suggesting that they did during the flood. Look at the devastation they caused today, then increase that by 7 orders of magnitude and spread it out across the whole planet instead of being concentrated in one location. It seems to me that in this video, you are successfully pointing out some of the biggest problems with the flood story. There is zero evidence of this kind of mass destruction happening ever, much less only 4,000 years ago.
However, because of the speed of this process, the tsunamis were hundreds of feet high.
So that's several tsunamis every day, hundreds of feet high, and you don't see a problem with a mere 50-foot tall boat floating around in these ridiculously turbulent waters? The Ark encounter spends a lot of time and energy trying to present apologetics for how Noah and his family could have been able to care for that many animals on the boat. But what I want to know now is, how did they even walk on their boat? Their boat would have been capsized multiple times per day in the environment that you're describing. How do you feed and water thousands of animals every day while having to hold on for dear life because your boat flips over every few minutes?
Nothing on the continent could withstand these massive surges.
Exactly. Nothing on the continent could withstand them. And guess where the Ark started out? On the continent. Maybe not the specific continent you're talking about in this video, but the same statement applies. The tsunamis actually would have been more of an issue for the Ark before all the land was covered with water and after the water was receding. A tsunami in the open ocean might be less than 30 centimeters high, but once it hits shallower water, they can surge 30 meters high, and that's with our slow-moving continents of today that are only going 30 centimeters per year. Crank that number up by a few orders of magnitude, and I'm sure you could get higher waves. The Ark would have been turned to kindling before even having a chance to float.
Early in this unfolding cataclysm, the Sauk, Tippecanoe, and Kaskaskia megasequences of fossil-bearing sediments were deposited over North America.
There are a number of problems here. For each cratonic sequence or megasequence, there are specific organisms that you can find that correlate with the time they existed. If they were caused by tsunamis hitting the continent over a short period of time, why are the organisms not mixed up? The Kaskaskia sequence heads into the Carboniferous period, which contained vast swampy forests that produced the majority of the world's coal. How did these forests have time to grow and develop their own ecosystems that are entirely distinct from those found in the Sauk sequence over the course of, what, a few days, weeks, months? No matter how much time you give it, it's not enough. There are also sedimentary deposits within those sequences that would not have been possible in the environment that you're describing. The massive evaporite deposits in the Michigan Basin couldn't have formed in this environment. In order for evaporite to form, it needs the water to collect in a basin that has a limited input of new water for enough time for significant evaporation to occur. Like 50% of the water has to evaporate before the first minerals even start to form. With how large the deposits in Michigan are, there wouldn't have been time for enough water to evaporate from them, especially with how frequently these tsunamis that you're proposing would have had to splash over the entire continent. And that's not even getting into, again, the rain.
Seawater rose globally as a result of new seafloor formation and increased thermal expansion. However, because only a small portion of the global seafloor had been replaced by new, warmer, more buoyant seafloor, these first three megasequences were mostly affecting the shallow marine realm, as the sea level was not high enough to inundate the North American interior.
Are you even listening to yourself? You literally said the tsunamis would be so high and have so much energy that they would crash into the continent and nothing on the continent would be able to withstand them.
However, because of the speed of this process, the tsunamis were hundreds of feet high. Nothing on the continent could withstand these massive surges.
Now you're saying that they were gentle enough to have only affected the shallow marine environments at first? Well, what about the swampy forests that didn't exist during the Sauk sequence? How did a massive inland sea develop and then evaporate over Michigan within a year? Why were none of the marine creatures from the Sauk sequence ever swept up into the Tippecanoe sequence? Why was nothing from the Tippecanoe sequence found in the Sauk or Kaskaskia sequences? These sequences are not just different areas along the coast of North America, they are all across the continent, one on top of the other. Organisms from the Sauk sequence are found in the same areas as organisms from the Tippecanoe or Kaskaskia sequences, but they are always found in the same order, from bottom to top. Why would there not be any mixed up ones if these sequences actually formed in the way that you are suggesting?
It was not until the later Absaroka sequence, when sea level was higher, that we see the first coal seams and land animals mixed in with marine animals in the fossil record.
Yeah, you're right. It's completely impossible that any of these land animals could have been near the coast when the first tsunami hit. And the hundreds of known genera from just the Ediacaran period couldn't possibly have mingled with the genera from the surrounding periods because reasons. Right.
Once the Pacific and Farallon plates began forming in earnest during the Absaroka phase, subduction began along the west coast on a massive scale. The weight of the subducting slab along the western edge of North America caused that region to be depressed, and the Zuni megasequence began.
The Zuni sequence, which includes several formations of black shale, indicating a stagnant water column. Somehow, I don't think that a worldwide flood that included several tsunamis every day is compatible with deposition that is indicative of stagnant water.
This rapid plate tectonic process and subsequent sedimentation buried the pre-flood lowlands first in the southwest, what we call the Triassic today, New Mexico and West Texas. This was soon followed by the Jurassic system rocks across Utah and Colorado, and then the Cretaceous system across Wyoming and Montana.
Okay, correct me if I'm wrong here, but your argument seems to be that the explanation for why we don't see organisms from one period mixed up with organisms from another period is that different tsunamis and geologic activity cause different regions to be buried at different times. Okay, fine, but just look at the maps in your own damn video. Do you see how many of those circles representing fossil finds for each time period overlap? I've taken the liberty of merging the maps together so you can see it properly. There are several spots where there were finds from all three time periods in the same place. So that demonstrates that these organisms were not living in different regions from each other. Plenty of them lived in the same regions. So why was there no mixing of organisms from the same region but in different time periods? The most reasonable explanation is that the time period itself is so vast that the organisms were not separated by space but by time, which again brings up the question of how these entire ecosystems could possibly have developed, been wiped out by a tsunami, had a new one developed, and then get wiped out by another tsunami over a period of months. That is simply not enough time for the ecosystems that we see. Now, I'm skipping a bunch because he goes over the formation of the Western Interior Seaway, and aside from having the timescale wrong by several orders of magnitude, he actually does a fairly decent job explaining it. And aside from pointing out that a good chunk of North America was underwater in the past, this part really has nothing to do with the rest of the video.
But think about it. If the mountains were created slowly over millions of years, why are so many of them filled with dead creatures that are buried in the mud that killed them?
I know, right? It's impossible for there to have been a mudslide without the entire Earth being flooded and experiencing geologic activity at a ridiculously fast rate. It's not like we ever see mudslides that kill anything today. Oh wait, there was one in California just last year, wasn't there? Not to mention the thousands of people that die in landslides every year. Yeah, a landslide is not necessarily a mudslide, but mudslides are included in that number.
The thousands of mass bone graveyards in the Jurassic and Cretaceous layers are filled with both land and marine creatures that are entombed by the very mud that covered them, causing their death.
Yeah, sure. You're saying that like it's supposed to be a surprising fact that demolishes our current model for how fossilization happened. Rapid burial is an important part of the fossilization process. Nobody is trying to hide that. And sometimes it happens in mud. And sometimes the mud that buries the animal is the same mud that killed it. An animal being buried in mud is not itself indicative of a worldwide flood. It is simply indicative of a mudslide.
In some places, this happened so quickly that only adult dinosaurs are found entombed in the mud as they were fleeing for their lives.
Okay, now that line of reasoning makes no sense. Are you saying it's impossible for a baby dino to be buried in the mud because babies couldn't run as fast as the adults? The lack of baby dinosaurs says nothing to the veracity of the flood. And for a possible explanation as to why we don't see baby dinosaurs, I'll point you to a TED Talk by Jack Horner, who has proposed that baby dinosaurs could have looked very different from the adults based on our knowledge of the development of crested birds. Also, fun fact, Jack Horner is the guy who put Mary Schweitzer on the analysis of the T-Rex femur that led to the soft tissue discovery. These things are probably related. Horner opened his own museum specifically because other museums wouldn't let him cut their fossils in order to examine the bone density to determine the dinosaur's age. Younger animals have a lower bone density as the bones are in the process of expanding as the animal grows. So it is possible that the T-Rex femur in which we discovered this soft tissue might have been transported in a different method that wouldn't have required cutting it had the excavation been performed under someone else. I mean, maybe not. It doesn't matter either way, but I like to think they're connected.
Here's one massive graveyard in northern Montana that's over 1.2 miles long and contains 30 million fossil fragments, representing over 10,000 adult Maiasaura that were simultaneously buried. In this entire collection of bones, not a single baby was found.
Okay, that's nice. But even if I grant this and don't point out the possibility that the baby Maiasaura were mistaken for a different, smaller species, as Jack Horner demonstrates is entirely possible, what does this have to do with a flood? Why would being an adult mean you get buried in mud, but being a baby means you didn't? Does size have something to do with it? Because we have plenty of small dinosaurs too, so that doesn't hold up. Seriously, what is your point here?
Every one of these 10,000 Maiasaura was between 9 and 23 feet long. Does this seem like the adult dinosaurs were stampeding away from the raging floodwaters, with 100% of their young falling behind and being engulfed in a different region? Many of these creatures were buried so quickly, their soft tissues are still preserved to this day.
Soft after an acid bath to dissolve all the hard parts. Now, as far as the soft tissue is concerned, I will provide a link to a playlist I've put together of different videos that discuss that particular claim, including myself, Apologia, Stated Clearly, and Tony Reed. That's where I'll leave it for today. The rest of this video starts jumping all over different topics, so I'll cover that in part 2. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Insane Tester, who says, "This is a case of an atheist having an even poorer understanding of morality than the theists. The death penalty is the deliberate, premeditated, and sadistic killing of a human. It's murder. Did I say that it's purposely sadistic so that the viewers can derive pleasure of the ritualistic killing? And your example of self-defense killing is not at all self-defense. And on top of it all, you confuse morality with legality." This was on my video responding to AiG's Demolishing Biblical Contradictions book. Well, Insane Tester, you seem to have not been paying close attention to the video, which is fine. I often listen to things in the background while doing other stuff, so I miss stuff as well. But in the future, maybe make sure you pay attention before commenting things like this. I said right in the video that I morally object to the death penalty, though I do agree that it is a separate category than a private citizen killing another private citizen. Just because I think it's a separate category does not mean I think it's okay. And my example of self-defense was not a good example, but it wasn't my example. It was the one that they chose to use in the book. And I don't think I ever conflated morality with legality, but feel free to point out where I did. I don't think that I did, as I don't consider something automatically moral just because it's legal, but if I implied that, point it out and I will issue a correction. So remember to follow me on social media, and for early access to my videos, consider becoming a patron. See you next time. Well, oh god, that sounded like a fucking frog.